Hi, everyone. This is a recording of a webinar titled Get Inspection Ready for E6 R3. The beginning of this webinar has been partially re-recorded due to technical difficulties. I'm Denise Lacey, a GCP QA consultant with a focus on inspection readiness. And I'm also the co-founder of ReadyRoom, which is an inspection readiness and management system. Later on in the recording, you'll hear Preeya Beczek of Beczek.com, regulatory consultant, as well as Tracy Posadowski, who is our marketing lead at ReadyRoom. Thank you so much for joining us today. The topic for today is to consider how the new Good Clinical Practice Guideline E6 Revision 3 is likely to affect GCP regulatory inspections post-adoption. We don't want to make this into just another training on E6 R3. Instead, we want to look ahead to the challenges we might encounter while implementing the new parts of E6 R3, and then even further ahead to the types of inspection questions that might be raised in conjunction with those factors. In other words, we're not here to give all of the answers, but rather to raise a bunch of questions. And then in the future, we'll see how well we did. We're going to start with a quick overview regarding E6R3, and then we have 5 topics to tackle: quality by design, clinical trial transparency, site staff roles and responsibilities, systems and data, and withdrawal and termination. For each topic, we'll look at what's new on the topic in E6R3, and then what's challenging about it. And then we'll present potential inspection questions that you might need to get ready for. We also have some examples of the kinds of storyboards you might be developing over the next few years to address these topics. All questions and storyboards are hypothetical. So let's move on to a quick overview. Revision 3 of the ICH GCP guideline was released in draft form in May 2023. After a comment period, the ICH made some changes. And if you would like to know what changed between the draft and the final, we have a series of posts on our ReadyRoom blog that detail what's changed. Then the ICH released the final document in January of 2025. This brings us to step 4 of the 5-step implementation process. Now each country or region will follow its own timelines to implement the final guideline. R3 is going to become effective in the EU in July 2025, so just days away at this point. The main driver for revision 3 was the amount of time, almost 30 years, that had passed since the first release of E6 in 1996. Although there was a revision in 2016, it was pretty limited. Since 1996, the scope and complexity of clinical trials has really expanded. Technology has evolved, we've had a pandemic, and there's also more interest in applying GCP to non-industry studies, including the use of real-world data. Finally, we've had a revision to the E8 guideline, which is called General Considerations for Clinical Trials, which introduced the concept of quality by design. The goal of this revision wasn't just to add a few corrections or patches here and there, which is what we saw with revision 2. Rather, the intention was to renovate E6 completely to focus on overarching principles or key concepts of clinical research that could then be applied to both industry and non-industry trials. Here is a visual of how the content has been moved around from revision 2 to revision 3. The intro and principles are now the first 2 numbered sections. All the content relevant specifically to industry trials is now collected in a section called Annex 1, which is section 3, and the idea is that other annexes will be added to address either other types of trials or other aspects of research. In fact, Annex 2 has been drafted to address decentralized elements, pragmatic elements, and real-world data. Within Annex 1, we still have the sections carried over for IRB and Ethics Committee responsibilities and investigator and sponsor responsibilities, but now there is an entirely new section on data governance that applies to both investigators and sponsors. Then the IB protocol and essential records sections have been moved to appendices that will apply to studies in Annex 1 as well as to all the other annexes. I categorize the changes in E6 R3 roughly as follows. Most of the changes in blue here simply reflect industry standards that have evolved over the past 30 years, ways of working that have become more or less standard, but which for some reason have never been part of E6 before. For example, the practice of having sponsors handle central IRB submissions. We've been doing that for a long time, but it's just now called out in E6. Another big bucket of changes here in the orange are practices that have been soft requirements for the EMA and MHRA for years, but have only recently been codified in E6 R3. By soft requirements, I mean requirements that have been stated in Q&As and guidances, but which some Americans have been unaware of because FDA doesn't really emphasize them. For example, the requirement that sponsors must not have exclusive control of the data came from an EMA Q&A. Then there is the new stuff. Nothing, I suppose, is truly new. All of the changes have some kind of antecedent, but these items are neither standard practice across the industry nor previous EMA MHRA requirements. So for our first topic, Preeya is going to talk about quality by design.
Okay, so thank you very much, Denise. So the requirements for quality by design in the new guidelines states that we need to identify critical to quality factors prospectively. And here really it's very important to know that these factors with meaningful impact on participant rights, safety, well-being, and data integrity are very important. So this is really specific in what the guideline is asking us to, be identifying critical to quality factors for. The next one here is around implementing strategies to avoid, detect, address, and prevent reoccurrence of non-compliance. So how should that be, stated? I think it's really clear here around proportionate and risk-based approach. Then it talks about describing quality management approach, and this should be described in the CSR. And also here you see the last point around summarizing important quality issues, including when the quality, target lists are exceeded, or the quality target levels, were exceeded, and also the remediations. All of this information needs to go into the CSR. So there's a lot to think about here. Back to you, Denise.
Thanks, Preeya. The concept of risk management was introduced in E6 R2, so that part isn't new. However, study teams have really been struggling with it ever since. For years, we've seen teams that have difficulty separating risks from issues. And so now we are taking this concept of risk management and we're introducing the concept of the critical to quality factor, which is the factor that is at risk, right? And we expect study teams to struggle with this too. If you look at some of the supporting materials that have been developed by CTTI and Transcelerate, you can see that it's even muddy in these materials. For example, they consider everything to be a potential critical to quality factor. So inclusion, exclusion criteria are critical to quality factors, but training is also a critical to quality factor. Protocol design is a critical to quality factor. And so we think that this really confuses the concept of a critical to quality factor with a mitigation that might actually reduce the risk. So we kind of see more of this based on what we saw with E6 R2, where everyone, in my opinion, kind of went overboard implementing tools to do risk assessment that a lot of times didn't really foresee risk. The quality tolerance limits, or the QTLs, are another potential challenge. So I've heard that there was a bit of a battle on the R3 committee about whether we should even use the term quality tolerance limits at all. And the final guidance uses the term acceptable ranges and then in parentheses, e.g. quality tolerance limits. And I guess that was the compromise. So the idea here is that we should have a threshold in mind, which, if exceeded, would constitute an impact to patient safety or data integrity. And that's a great idea, but it's sometimes really difficult to know what those thresholds should be. And my concern is that if teams are going overboard identifying 50 critical to quality factors, and then they have to come up with, 40 risks and then 40 quality tolerance limits, that they're going to guess wrong and set inappropriate limits. And so now R3 says that when these ranges are exceeded, we should do an evaluation to determine if CAPAs are needed. And so we expect that either study teams are going to be doing these evaluations way more than they would expect to because they set the wrong limits, or they're just not going to do them at all, and then they won't be in compliance. Now, along with this, we have the expectation that quality issues should be documented in the CSR. So if we set those quality tolerance limits too narrowly and we exceed them, then we're expected to document them in the CSR. So we need a process for that. And R3 also says that we have to include other quality issues in the CSR. And we've got all kinds of quality issues occurring on clinical trials. So we're going to need a process to determine, what do we put in the CSR and what do we leave out? And we hope that we don't guess wrong when a regulatory authority looks at it. So, sponsors work with a lot of vendors. Typically, they rely on their CROs to manage this risk management process. But we are seeing sponsors increasingly take this on themselves, mainly because CROs are managing a process that includes all of the activities that are outsourced to the CRO. And typically, the sponsor is managing additional activities. So by nature, a CRO's management of risk will be a little bit narrower than the sponsor needs. For this topic, I'm including this slide, which just kind of shows how we tend to present quality by design to our trainees to differentiate between critical to quality factor, risk, quality tolerance limit, and mitigations. And I won't go over this in detail. It'll just be here in the slides if this is useful for you. And then Preeya is going to talk about possible inspection questions in this area.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. And apologies, this might be a little bit small on the slide here, but what this is showing in our Ready Room tool are the types of questions that inspectors might ask you as sponsors during an inspection around the quality by design topic. So you can see some here, in the red zone, what critical to quality factors were identified for this study. In the orange middle zone there, the yellow color, which documentation is filed to show that HCPs or patients community were consulted. Things like, why wasn't issue X included in the CSR? What other mitigations were planned to address the risks? And I see that there is one question that's come up. Perhaps, Denise, we can quickly take this question. Which is around, so Kelly Hall, thank you, Kelly, for this question around what is the current regulatory thinking on how often risk assessment should be done or should be updated throughout the study life cycle. So I can give my view, and Denise, maybe you have a quick view on this as well, but certainly, of course, it depends on how long your study is, right? The duration of your study. Some studies can be really short. Some studies can go on for, 2-3 years. So there should be a cycle that's defined on how often a risk assessment is done. I've seen some companies have like a 3-month cycle or a 6-month cycle on risk assessment, and they have a team of people, identified to do the risk identification, assessment, and feedback as well. So Denise, I don't know if you have a quick view on this.
Yeah, so thanks, Kelly. There's no, GCP doesn't dictate any kind of cadence here. But basically, what they are going to do is look at what you have defined in your SOPs and in your plan and say that's the cadence that you need to stick to, right? So everything with GCP now is risk-based. And so in an inspection situation, you might expect to have to defend, like, why did you decide you only needed to do one risk assessment? But I think a principle of risk management is that you are revisiting your risks, and also you're looking at the issues that you've encountered and you're seeing if they affect your risks at all. Okay. And so I think we have another question. Can you provide the reference to the EMA question about data control? And yes, I have that on a slide later, so we'll highlight that when we get to it.
Yeah.
Thanks. If you have other questions, please put them in the Q&A. I want to kind of make sure we're sticking to the time. I'm just displaying here, this is an example of the kind of storyboard that you might create to show how you implemented quality by design into your study. And so this storyboard highlights the SOP that defines how critical to quality factors are documented, and then the mitigations that were put into place for this particular study. And again, this is all hypothetical, but it's an example of the kind of storyboard that I envision the teams that I work with creating as they move forward. Okay. I think we might need to move on to the next topic just so that we can stick to the time. But certainly, if you have any other questions, please put them in the Q&A. And if we don't get to them in this section, we'll address them after the session. So now we're going to move on to our second topic, which is clinical trial transparency. Preeya?
Yes, thank you, Denise. So let's look at the requirements here in the new version. Here, transparency, defined in the guidelines really includes these items. So transparency is addressed in both the principles section and in Annex 1. It includes timely registrations on public databases, timely posting of results, availability of essential records for the retention period, which is no longer expressed as a definite period of time, but it refers to the local requirements. So there's a need to go deeper into understanding those local requirements. And then also it includes, you'll see here, the communication of trial results to participants in a non-promotional way, and also communication of treatment assignments to participants in blinded studies if they desire it. So it's really very clear how it's broken down, transparency requirements here. Denise, I think we have a poll question here that we want to launch, right? So let's see what the audience thinks here.
So yeah, we were really curious if your organization has a process for communicating treatment assignments to clinical trial participants. So Tracy, I'm not sure how that poll will come up, oh, there we go. All right. So actually that is our second poll, maybe. Do you have the first one there, Tracy?
I do. Sorry about that. One moment here.
All right. So we're curious, does your organization have a process for communicating treatment assignments? Yes, no, or not yet, but you're developing one. If you could just quickly click on a response there. And then I don't know, Tracy, where will we get the results for that?
I'll just end the poll now.
Okay. Oh, there we go. So about 29% of you do have a process for this, about 57% don't, and some of you are developing it. So That's interesting. I think maybe more people have a process than I thought would have it. I remember having a process like years and years ago, but I work with a lot of sponsors that do not have a process for this now. And so let's talk about some challenges with with transparency here. So one challenge is simply the fact that we used to have a process for registering protocols and putting results on clinicaltrials.gov. Now we have one that covers like a whole bunch of different regions, including the EU. And so at many smaller sponsors, ClinOps was actually responsible for clinicaltrials.gov posts. But typically regulatory handles CTIS submissions. So it really makes more sense to have regulatory handle this for everybody, right? So some sponsors might find that they need to harmonize their procedures. And, we work with a lot of sponsors that have been struggling with this for a couple of years, especially smaller companies. They just don't reach the end of studies very often, right? So sometimes they forget to post their results on time. So now they have to post them in a couple of different places. We also have some new requirements for ICF language. So GCP says that the ICF must include a statement to the effect that the trial may be registered on publicly accessible databases. No specific language is required, unlike the US regulation that has a specific statement that must be produced word for word about clinicaltrials.gov. And so one pitfall that we see is that recently we've seen a lot of ICFs where they try to smash the two statements together. And this is not a great idea because the US statement must be reproduced word for word. So if you try to combine the two, then you're going to be out of compliance in the US. So a small challenge, but a real issue that we've seen. But where I think sort of the unknown is, we're going to need to determine whether participants want to be informed about their treatment assignments, right? GCP clearly says that. So do we need to train investigators to include this as part of the consent process? Would we expect to see it documented in the source? So do we need to train monitors to look for it now as they look for other bits of the informed consent discussion to be documented? Or should we be capturing it in the consent form? And then what happens if they change their minds about that? Just kind of introduces a whole bunch of complications. Then we have to think about how we are distributing the treatment assignments. And those of you that have processes, I'm sure the rest of us would love to know how you do this. Are we waiting for the CSR to be final and then sending that to the sites? Or are we sending just a list of treatment assignments to each site? And then, how are we QCing that to make sure that it's accurate? Because that would not be good if we had an inaccurate, listing go out. If it's a study with a long-term follow-up, are we having the site monitors check the source to see if the sites actually did communicate the treatment assignment? And then the last challenge here is about communicating trial results to participants in a non-promotional way. The easiest way to do this would be to have the sites inform the participants to go to CTIS or clinicaltrials.gov and look up the results. But Preeya was telling me the other day that she's working with some sponsors that send out like a short communication to the sites. And Preeya, you can chime in if I'm getting that wrong. So do those communications have to be IRB approved? Are they going to be reviewed by your promotional review board? Just a whole bunch of questions that, are not insurmountable, but we need to work out.
Yes, indeed, St. Denise, just to add a little bit there, this is quite tactical, right? So the sponsor needs to tell the sites, and then the sites need to think about how they're going to further communicate. So there's a cascade, and that has to be controlled. And the messaging has to be right as well, but also understandable, right, by the study participants as well. So even though it's just a small letter or however that you decide to do it, it can be quite a task that needs coordination, perhaps review by the regulatory team, legal team, IRB, so lots of considerations. And especially if you put this in the hopper with the understanding local requirements piece, which we talked about just a moment ago, this could become a nice gesture, but becomes quite an operational task to really manage well. Yeah.
Good point. Yes. All right. So Preeya, do you want to talk about some possible inspection questions?
Yep, thank you. So again, here you're seeing an image of the Ready Room tool, and you can see here some of the questions that could come up in this topic around transparency, which could be around, what is your process for determining registration reporting requirements for a new clinical study? Often I find clients that I work with get stuck between, whose responsibility is this? And then have they done it, right? That's always a challenge. Another question could be, what process was followed to verify that communications with participants were non-promotional? So here you go. This means there needs to be a review involved here somewhere. And then another question could be, how were treatment assignments and clinical trial results communicated to the participants? So these are the types of questions that could come up.
So this is the kind of storyboard we might envision. We actually developed this storyboard now for clinicaltrials.gov postings, but this just reflects an expanded process for determining requirements. So we are kind of running up on time. So I think we're going to move on to the next session, and then we'll see if we can catch up and do more of a Q&A after the next one. We weren't sure how quickly these were all going to go, but I do want to make sure that we stay on time so we can get everybody to their next meetings on time. So let's move on and talk about site roles and responsibilities. And Preeya is going to talk about the newish requirements here.
Yes, thanks, Denise. So yeah, indeed, newish is the right word for this particular section, right? Because there's a number of new requirements here, but many of them fall into the bucket of industry standards that are new to GCP. So, that's an important note. However, since they were codified in GCP, they raise some questions. And, Denise will talk a little bit about challenges in a moment. First, here you can see we have a new principle that roles and responsibilities must be clearly documented with subtasks that cover delegation, agreements, oversight. The new principle is echoed in the investigator's responsibility section as well, in the step that says that investigators may delegate trial-related activities. R2 didn't actually say this, it implied it, but it didn't say it. So by stating this in R3, that investigators should maintain a list of people to whom activities were delegated is new there, and a very important point. The interesting part here, though, is that R3 now says that sponsors may support investigators by hiring service providers for them, but the investigator retains the final decision on whether the service provider is appropriate, right? So you can see that kind of joint, dual kind of responsibility there, working in partnership, the investigator and the sponsor. And also the investigator must ensure that delegated personnel are qualified, informed. Of course, they need to be trained on the trial. Even if the sponsor has hired them, the investigator has to ensure all of these things. And then the investigator must oversee the personnel, even if the sponsor has hired them. Yes, it's a bit what I call yin yang here, right? So oversight can be risk-based, right? So that's really important. And then finally, what I wanted to say is that the investigator is still required to maintain a record of delegations, but this also can be risk-based. So where activities are performed as part of a clinical practice, a delegation record may not be required. So there's quite a lot going on here in terms of roles and responsibilities between the sponsor, the investigator, and maybe other roles, right, that are delegated as well. So this is a really nice one to get to know a bit more and really understand how this is done, how is it done currently, and what's changing for the team. Denise, I think we might have another poll here, so I'll hand over to Tracy and yourself.
Yeah, so while Tracy's getting the poll up, it is a lot to unpack here because we're talking about roles and responsibilities. And so my big question is, how do we differentiate between service providers who should be overseen by the sponsor and service providers that should be overseen by the investigator? And so very simple question for you, is a central lab a provider that should be overseen by the sponsor or by an investigator? So please enter your response.
Okay, we'll end the poll now. I'll share the results.
All right, so 92% say sponsor, 8%. All right, I like the iconoclast. They say the investigator. I was expecting almost everyone to say the sponsor, of course, right? Because central labs are always overseen by the sponsor. It's just the way we've always done it. But the point I'm trying to make here is, why are we making that distinction? So central labs are handling human samples and they're alerting the PI to safety issues just like local labs are. If you think back to your SAT days and analogies, for those of you in the US, sorry, that was US centric, a central lab is to a local lab like a home health nurse is to an on-site nurse. But we think of central labs as vendors that are managed by the sponsor and home health nurses as vendors that are delegated by the investigator, right? Even though the sponsor hires them. So why? Like, what are we basing this on? Because we need some principles in order to be able to implement R3, right? And know which vendors need to be delegated by the investigator, which need to be approved by the investigator, which need, to be overseen by the investigator. So I don't think we're going to be seeing investigators approving central labs moving forward, but it does point out how fuzzy our criteria are for determining who owns a particular service provider. Some other challenges here, we might need some clear documentation of the investigator's acceptance of service providers that we hire. And we also might increasingly run into situations where sponsor contracted resources might have to prove in some way that they are not biased, or we might have to come up with some ways to minimize bias. So Preeya is going to go over some questions that we might expect.
Yes, thank you, Denise. So in the same fashion here, you can see, some questions that we can expect around, can you provide documentation that shows that each investigator approved the use of the home health nursing organization? Another question could be around the PI site. So how did the PI at site 001 determine which study-specific training was required for staff conducting the mobile vision clinic exams? So there's always this thing around training, right? Having a record. And perhaps another question could be, what steps did the sponsor take to ensure that staff it hired to enter the data at site X were free from bias? Okay, so interesting.
And I think that this goes to Kelly's question in the chat. I know you can't all see it, but Kelly asked, how will inspectors expect to see oversight of vendors documented under R3, especially when tasks are delegated? And I think that that's the big question, right? Like, we are going to have to train our investigators on what they should be doing and have them document somewhere how they are going to be overseeing resources that are hired by the sponsor. And that's very simple when we are hiring them a study coordinator, because they already have mechanisms in place to oversee the people that work at a site. But when we are hiring them a mobile vision clinic, or when we're hiring them a telehealth organization, we are going to have to help them come up with some kind of a written plan on how to do this. So here's the kind of storyboard that we might develop. This one just lists out for a particular study who the sponsor contracted to work under site supervision, how the PIs approved them, how they were delegated, trained, supervised, and then here at the end we have a couple of deviations that we're putting on the storyboard just so that we are aware of them. So that's the kind of storyboard that I would expect to see to address that very question. All right. I think we should move on to data integrity. This is actually kind of a long section with a couple of subsections. So Preeya, do you want to talk about investigators and data?
Yes, thank you, Denise. So another interesting part. So here, the first requirement here has to do with the investigators and data. GCP now says that sponsors should ensure that access permissions granted to investigators site staff align with delegated responsibilities and are visible to the inspector. Also, sponsors are required to make sure that investigators have timely access to data, not just the EDC data, but all relevant data from external sources, unless the data would be unblinding. The other requirement here, the third requirement, is really talking about where sponsors are to seek investigator endorsement. For example, an endorsement would be when the investigator e-sign casebooks. But as with the point above, so, thinking about that, then this should also apply to all relevant data. And then finally, the final bullet point here is talking about when the sponsor should ensure that investigators have access to the required data for retention purposes.
Thanks, Preeya. So we've got a couple of potential challenges here. The first is kind of minor, but E6 says that we have to ensure that investigators have visibility into site staff roles and permissions in data capture systems. Usually a person's role is visible to the person logging in, but we don't really have a mechanism for informing the investigator of the roles and permissions of their individual site staff. So we might need to think about how we are going to communicate that to make sure that the investigator is aware of which permissions are attached to certain roles and which roles their site staff are assigned. And we could probably cobble that together from the bits of information that we send to the investigators now, the manual for the EDC system, the ECCGs, the user list, right? But a bigger issue, much bigger issue, is the proliferation of external data in clinical trials. So as Preeya just said, we tend to think of data as, clinical data as the EDC system, and that is what we would call the clinical database. But we might need to assess other data streams, central lab data, specialty lab data, IRT data, ePro data, and determine what investigators need to access in order to evaluate safety and efficacy and eligibility, and also how they're going to access it, and then how they are going to endorse it if we think that that is necessary, and retain it. So we're used to PIs endorsing ECRFs. They have an e-signature, and sometimes they endorse lab reports individually, right, when they sign off on them. But we don't always have them endorse like ePro data or IRT data. And sometimes sponsors address this by integrating their data with the EDC data so that the investigators are signing off on all of it at once. But not always, so we need to think about that. And a lot of times these other data streams are not provided to the sites. They're not, we don't send them, IRT data like we would send ECRF data. So we need to increasingly think about the whole data flow of our studies. Okay, so part 2 of this is data changes, and Preeya is going to talk about this.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. So we've talked about investigators and data. Now with data changes, I think none of this is going to be a surprise, but maybe from the angle that it's really detailed, right? These requirements here. So firstly, it talks about sponsors, not making changes, that sponsors should not make any changes to data entered by the investigator or trial participants unless it's justified and agreed upon in advance by the investigator and documented. Okay, so there you go. That's one, big requirement there. Also, the sponsor should allow correction of errors, including data entered by participants where requested by the investigators or participants. So this must be supported by source records around the time of the original entry. The next one here talks about data changes. So after unblinding, any data changes should be clearly documented, justified, authorized by the investigator, and reflected in an audit trail and reported in the CSR, and can only occur in exceptional circumstances. So there shouldn't be a habit formed and really shouldn't be even part of a process really, because it's exceptional circumstances. And then finally, you'll see there the piece around the sponsor should not have exclusive control of data captured in data acquisition tools to prevent undetectable changes. And I think, Denise, I'm quite passionate about what's challenging here, but I'll let you go first with the next slide, and I might have things to add there.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I just want to point out that Juan had asked what the reference is, and this is the reference for that statement about the sponsor not having exclusive control.
Yes.
So, having the sponsor change data has always been kind of tricky, right? But now we have something that says that investigators have to agree on changes in advance. So what counts as advanced agreement? Are we going to use a self-evident change model like we used to have when we were entering data into our own databases, where we would have the investigators agree to categories of changes in advance, and then the data entry team could correct a date if it was evident that, the month and year were mixed up or something like that? Or are regulators going to expect us to have documented investigator agreement for each individual change before it is made? And I'm thinking particularly of IRT systems, because a lot of IRT vendors have processes where the sites can call in to the help desk and say, oh, the system won't let me change X, Y, or Z because it's too late, but I need to change it. And then the help desk makes that change. So those changes tend to be documented in help desk tickets, which are not part of the data, and they're not even part of the TMF. So if we have processes like this, we need to think about how they're going to be documented. Preeya was also reminding me that we see lots of this documentation in notes to file and even in emails. And we really, need to think about that. Like, how are we going to have a complete listing of who agreed to what changes? Now, when we think about that requirement that Preeya had mentioned about sites and participants being able to change data, we need to think about how our eCOA and ePro systems are designed. Many of them do not let participants or sites make changes after a form is submitted or after a certain period of time. And so if we are permitting sites and patients to make justified changes, we need to think about the mechanisms for doing this. Another thing I want to point out is regarding back-end changes. When a data management group is making changes on the back end, either via the data capture system or in the underlying data set, we need to think about how these changes are being represented in the audit trail. We've seen some EDC systems that capture changes made by data management in a really unusual way, like it's attributed to system or it's really cryptically represented. And so one of the things you need to do when you're evaluating your data capture systems is look at how they capture these sort of changes in the audit trail. Our data management plans are going to need to be a lot more specific about this moving forward. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is sponsor control of data. So that's a hard concept. Basically, the way I read it is the site should be able to have eyes on their data at all times, so that if the sponsor decided to falsify data in some way, the site would at least have the opportunity to see it. So for example, if we cut off read access to an EDC system for the sites, and then the sponsor, keeps it offline for a month, and then the sponsor produces ECRF representations and sends them to the site, in theory, the sponsor could have changed the database while it was offline, or they could have changed the PDFs, right? Because they have exclusive control of the data in that scenario. So, we have a couple of different ways we could get around this. We can have give sites continuous access to their data, and then EMA has said in the past in inspections that I've been a part of that we should be having a third party produce those ECRFs, or we can have the sites download them directly. So this is something that FDA does not seem to be concerned about at all from what I've seen, but EMA is very concerned about it. And personally, I've been encountering this for at least, at 10 years now. So they've included in their Q&A. So Preeya, anything else to say here before we move on and talk about audit trails?
Well, I think we'll move on, Denise, because it kind of ties to this piece, right? We were talking about note to files, and it's such a normal way to document things, but having audit trails in your systems becomes even more important now, using that feature in your systems to make sure there's an audit trail when data has been changed. And here, this requirement really, emphasizes that with these two pieces around system owner, right? So the system owner should have procedures for implementing, evaluating, assessing, managing, and reviewing relevant metadata associated with critical data. Companies struggle with this. Who's the system owner of that system? Who's the system owner of this system? So this requirement is really going to make people think around, not only the system owner piece, but around, metadata, so that you can get a good audit trail. And then the second requirement here is around procedures for planned risk-based review of trial-specific audit trails. These should always be in place. So, these two requirements in themselves really underpin everything we've said above around data. And I think, Denise, you're going to talk about what's challenging here.
Absolutely. So the concept of audit trail review is pretty common in GLP and GMP, but it's fairly new to GCP. And I should have had a poll question about who is doing this already. Teams I work with tend to say okay, our audit trail is huge. It's 10,000 pages. We validated our system. What am I reviewing it for? And so one of the things that is a challenge is we need to help our study teams define the purpose and methodology for audit trail reviews. For example, we should be making sure that CRAs are reviewing the audit trail when they're SDVing data to see why original data entries were changed and by whom as part of the whole picture, to make sure that authorized users are making changes and that they're appropriately delegated. And, most CRAs do this, but it might not be mentioned in your monitoring plan, and maybe not all of them are doing it. We also need to review user access audit trails to verify that principal investigators are being given access to an IRT system before the study started, or to verify that right access was removed at database lock. We might be looking through the audit trail for changes to data so that we can make sure that somebody wasn't inappropriately given a permission to make changes, so that doesn't stick out when we're looking at that audit trail. We might also look at the timing of SDV activities when we're doing on-site monitoring to make sure that they coincided with site monitoring visits. You can be sure that your inspectors are going to be doing that. So we want to do that before they do it and just make sure that there's nothing, out of the ordinary there. We might be looking for verification of post-lock changes, for verification of back-end changes. And if we are migrating systems, for example, TMFs, we might want to see what that looks like in the audit trail as well. So some possible inspection questions here.
Yes, indeed, Denise. I won't go through all of these, but people can guess, right, the questions that are going to come up. It's going to be around permissions, access. What is the sponsor's process for ensuring access to data in the event of site closure? What controls were in place to show that data were not under the sponsor's exclusive control, right? So this is going to be around those areas. Yeah.
Thanks. And then, here's an example of a storyboard, what controls were in place to show that data in the EDC system were not under the sponsor's exclusive control. So this is how you might explain it by referring to your DMP for the study specific procedures, by referring to your SOP to show, that your EDC system and your other systems are being, left open until the ECRF representations are communicated to your sites. So with that, I think we will move on to our last topic, which is withdrawal and termination. And Preeya is going to go over the new requirements.
Thank you, Denise. So here the requirements on the surface look like they're, not anything new, but they are new. So the first one's really obvious, right? The informed consent form must include the process by which participants' data will be handled in the event of withdrawal or discontinuation. The next one, 2.92, is really interesting because although a participant is not obliged to provide a reason for withdrawing prematurely from the trial, the investigator should make a reasonable effort to ascertain the reason while fully respecting the participant's rights. So the investigator should consider if a discussion with the participant or the participant's legally acceptable representative is actually appropriate. And this discussion should focus on the reasons for ICH E6 R3 guideline talks about, guideline 20 talks about withdrawal to determine if there are ways to address the concerns, such as the participant could reconsider their withdrawal without unduly influencing their overall decision. And here it also talks about the investigator or delegated investigator site staff that they can consider, or they should consider, explaining to the participant the value of continuing their participation in the trial to minimize trial participants' withdrawal. And what's important to note is that in this process, the investigator should also ensure that it does not interfere with the participant's decision to refuse or withdraw of their participation at any time, right? It's up to the participant in the end. The final thing I want to point out here is that it's not a new requirement, but protocol sections more clearly differentiates between withdrawal from a trial and actually stopping treatment. So I think, Denise, you're going to be talking exactly about this on the next slide.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think this is anything new in clinical research. It's just being sort of highlighted here by these changes in R3. And the big challenge I see is that the terminology is confusing. So we sometimes talk about discontinuation from a study, and we also talk about discontinuation from treatment. We talk about withdrawal from a study, but we also talk about withdrawal of consent. And I think that there are three distinct kinds of consent withdrawal, and we might need to start differentiating. So a patient can withdraw consent for treatment. They can withdraw consent for treatment and for all observations and procedures, and they can withdraw consent from follow-up, or they can give consent for part of those things, right? And so we might need to differentiate between the patient who doesn't want any more drug administration, but is willing to come back for visits, and distinguish between the patient that won't do either of those things, but is willing to be called for follow-up, right? And so the question is, how are we going to do that? FDA guidance says that if the original consent form doesn't describe how these various scenarios are going to be handled, then patients should be signing a new consent that specifies their limited participation in the study. And we've seen those on some studies, but not all studies use them. Maybe they will be used more going forward. I think we also need to think about how we are going to train sites to address participant concerns without making it feel like they're being coerced into staying on the study. And so Preeya is going to go over a couple of potential questions here.
Yeah, thanks, Denise. So very quickly that, you might get asked by an inspector around how were sites trained to handle participants' issues when they wanted to withdraw consent. Or you might get asked what data was collected from participants who withdrew consent for treatment.
Okay. And then, this is the kind of storyboard that I might put together, summarizing all of the participants who withdrew consent, what they withdrew consent for, the dates that happened, and any data that was collected after their first consent withdrawal, just so that you would have that ready to, present to an inspector. So that brings us almost to the end of our time. We did not have as much time for questions and answers as I thought we would, But we would certainly welcome hearing from you if you have any questions, and we would also appreciate any information that you could share on how your companies are addressing these challenges. So we hope that we've achieved our objective of raising some interesting questions regarding how adoption of E6 R3 is going to play out in inspection readiness. And thank you so much for attending this session. We really appreciate your time. Tracy, anything to say to wrap up?
Just to reiterate that the slides will be available post-webinar, so give us about 24 hours and we'll include the recording for you as well. And we'll also be setting up a LinkedIn group. And as Denise said, there's the email addresses for both Denise and Preeya. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out directly. Thank you to everybody for attending today.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you very
everyone.
much.